back to. So with that, I will introduce Aimee. So I just learned that, because I was not sure how recently Professor Aimee Hilado had joined us at the university. So just since, did you say January?
I did, yes, that's right.
January. January, she's been here at the university, so new connections for her and for us. She is an assistant professor. Wait, you said tenured, so there should be associate.
Well, I actually started the clock again. I was tenured at a teaching institution, and so this is a bit of a shift, but a welcome shift to the research world.
Got it. We welcome you here. So she's an assistant professor in the Crown School, Crown Family School of Social Work and Policy and Practice, where she teaches and conducts research on complex trauma, early childhood and adult mental health, and clinical practice with forcibly displaced populations. Her work is informed by over a decade of clinical experience with diverse global populations across the lifespan, specializing in infant mental health practice with practice with unaccompanied children, and forensic psychological evaluations for asylum seekers. So with that, I will invite you to bring the slides back on the screen.
Excellent. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you again for the invitation. Again, this is a presentation that is going to speak to how we can welcome newcomers, and I say that broadly, refugee and immigrant populations who've experienced trauma and who are rebuilding their lives here in the US. And so what I'm hoping to cover today is to first provide an overview of what immigration trauma looks like amongst transnational populations, take a moment to define the themes of immigration trauma and how it shows up in these groups, and then really lessons from the field. I wear this dual hat of being a clinician and a researcher so that practice-informed research, research-informed practice paradigm really does ground how I enter this work in the field and what I really hope to share moving forward. And then I'll leave time at the end for Q&A. I tend to start here. As mentioned, I've had the privilege of spending the last 15 years as a licensed clinical social worker and as an applied social scientist, working with populations from across 5 different global regions: Central and Eastern Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Each of these arriving communities have been so diverse in the traditions that they value, the dialects that they speak, the religions that they practice. And again, as a therapist in the field, I bear witness to the stories of people who will make incredibly difficult decisions to leave their home country with no guarantee of survival. They oftentimes tell me about having no choice but to leave their countries, that they are fleeing corrupt governments, war, the lack of access to basic resources like an education or healthcare or a job. Some of them are fleeing because of climate change, natural disasters that destroy entire communities, and there's no infrastructure to rebuild. Many of the people I've worked with over the years, they're languishing in refugee camps. They have been. They are waiting at closed borders, hoping to file for asylum. These are the images of those folks. They cross dangerous bodies of water. They are walking long distances, sometimes by night because they don't want to be detected, or they're trafficked by bus, by truck, by boat in dangerous conditions. And I oftentimes think about the survivors, because those who are able to reach their destination, they are survivors in every sense of the word. They go through the most horrific experiences over long periods of time, and they carry with them the hope that life can be better, that they can move forward amidst all their losses and sacrifices. And I think it's this work, really attending to the mental health needs of these populations, forcibly displaced groups across the lifespan, that really drives what I teach in the classroom. It's what I challenge, what I am curious about in my research program, and it certainly drives the advocacy work I do at the local, state, and federal level. And so when I think about the need, right now, according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees that oversees global migration movements, they're estimating about 90 million forcibly displaced persons globally. And that was only at the end of 2021. That number has only continued to rise with what we're seeing in the news, what we're hearing on the ground. It doesn't account completely for the number of Afghans who were displaced when the Taliban regime took over. It doesn't account for the 7.2 million Ukrainians who have fled the country when Russia invaded. And so again, the needs are there. But amidst all of that, I would say that the US has always been responsive to humanitarian crises, really thinking about safety and refuge for refugees and immigrants who are fleeing humanitarian issues, crises, needs that I've described. I have a 4-year-old that's asking for a tissue, so I'm sorry. One moment, I'm gonna just let him know he can. So you might see him join us shortly. But I will say that over the last decade, we have seen a change in the tone. That immigration, he's saying help. Can you hear him?
Yeah, it's okay. We're good with it.
All right. Sorry about that. He'll come up when he needs me to wipe his nose.
Yeah, we're good with it.
But what I was saying is that in the last decade, we've seen a substantial shift in more restrictive immigration policies. The tone, the public sentiment has really shifted. So I would say that, again, it's that feeling of, are we welcome here? That immigration status upon entry into this country has taken on a new and more important meaning because it will frame your rights and privileges here in this country. It defines how long you can be here. And the reality is that it's getting a lot harder to secure immigration relief in our country. So if I get to the next slide. To underscore the importance of immigration status, I oftentimes think of the statuses we often hear in the headlines. And so I want to briefly take a moment to walk through 4: refugee status, asylum status, undocumented, pre-documented status, and then parolee status. And so if I start with refugee status in the United States, that means that you began your application process abroad. That by definition from the UNHCR, a refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution, leaves their home country, crosses an international border, and then registers at a UNHCR processing site abroad. UNHCR is going to review each case and they'll determine whether or not you meet that definition. And if you do, you're issued an order of protection. All that means is you can stay in the country where you applied for refugee status, some type of immigration relief. And they'll say you have 3 options: repatriation, host country integration, or third country resettlement. Repatriation means you wait in this place of waiting where you filed your application, this host country. And then if things get better in your country, UNHCR is going to help you return home. The second option, host country integration, means the country where you temporarily applied for some type of relief, that country is going to give you citizenship. So I want you to think about all the Ukrainians that are waiting in Poland, or all the Syrian refugees that are waiting in Turkey, the equivalent of the Syrians getting Turkish citizenship. It doesn't happen often. So many of them are waiting for this third country resettlement option, being able to resettle in one of the 27 countries at the time, currently, across the globe that have an affiliation with UNHCR and will receive those approved with refugee status. And because of the pandemic, because of global restrictions, less than 1% are able to come to get that third country resettlement opportunity. It's a long process. So if you enter the United States with refugee status, on average, the time from when you applied initially through UNHCR to resettlement in the US, it's 17 years. That's the average. Waiting for a resolution, waiting for some type of relief. And many of the folks that I've worked with over the last decade plus, they've waited even longer, on average 22 to 23 years. But despite the wait, coming into the United States with refugee status, it's quite substantial, the benefits. That there's a direct pathway to citizenship. You can apply for a green card within 10 months of arrival. You can adjust your status to citizen within 4.5 years of arrival. You go through the State Department through a heavy vetting process, but you are assigned to an agency that will pick you up at the airport, that will take you to your first fully furnished apartment. And then within 48 hours, you're given a host of services like English language training, employment supports, housing supports, helping your kids get enrolled in school so you can adjust and integrate to life in your new community. But by 2018, when the refugee pipelines were really shuttered under the last administration, the pandemic really really just broke the infrastructure in terms of who could come in, even though they were approved and had been waiting. We found a lot of people that were seeking immigration relief in the US through the asylum program. Now, here in the US, there are two types of asylum applications, affirmative and defensive asylum. The difference is, unlike refugees who file for those applications, relief abroad, asylum applicants are applying once they're already here. Affirmative asylum is applied for at the border, and then defensive asylum are for those that are already in the interior of the United States. You still have to have the same grounds, similar to refugee status, that you have to leave, you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution. But the difference is asylum seekers don't have a pathway to citizenship, that they actually, an active asylum application just is a stay on deportation. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to help him. Can we pause really quick?
A ready nose.
He does have a ready nose, and here he comes, I can hear him. Let me just mute myself briefly.
Hey, Baba, I
Yes,
have a
baby.
ready-
Juggling motherhood with scholarship, it is always a fine dance.
We are good with it. No stress here.
Thank you. In the time of Zoom, I've just found that audiences tend to be a lot more just flexible, that we are juggling interesting lives. But back to the story of asylum seekers, that when you have an active asylum application, that's simply a stay on deportation. So it means that you could just wait here until a decision is made. It's not like refugees where you have an agency that's going to help you. You don't get employment authorization. You don't have the host of benefits. Some of them do, but not all. The benefits are limited. And some of the older applications, folks are waiting on average 4.5 to 5 years, only for a decision that could potentially mean that they're going to be deported to the country that they fled. So carry that weight. What is that going to be like? And then we think about those that don't have legal status in the United States. You're going to hear undocumented, some will say pre-documented, mixed status, meaning members of the family. Some of them have legal status to be here, some don't. They are US citizens that are born to parents who don't have status. What I would say is the vast majority of folks that fall under this category, they came into the United States with a valid visa. They came with a tourist visa, student visa, but when they overstayed the visa and beyond the timelines that were allowed, they then become undocumented. There are also those that are entering the country undetected, without paperwork. Recognize that they don't have any legal authority here. So a lot of the benefits, those are quite limited for them. Some of them may choose to file for asylum, but others will remain below the radar. And then you'll hear in the news, it's amazing to think that it's been a year since we saw the fall of the Afghanistan government, Taliban forces, and this rapid evacuation of people as the military was withdrawing in late August of last year. Parolee status is oftentimes what you will hear when we speak about Afghans who were evacuated. There's the special immigrant visa category that is also, you'll hear that in the news. Those are the folks that were interpreters for our military forces. These were the folks that work for the US embassies. If you were given a special immigrant visa, it's very similar to refugee status, all the rights and privileges, a pathway to citizenship. The tens of thousands of others who were evacuated were given humanitarian parolee. It's a temporary status, shorter than what typically falls under parolee status. It's 1 year. They were given employment authorization, medical benefits. They could avail of some of the programming that refugees receive, but there is no pathway to citizenship. And that 1 year mark ended this past August. So humanitarian parolees from Afghanistan are filing for asylum now. And this is why we're doing a lot of advocacy with Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. Recognizing that the US had a role in evacuating these people. We recognize the dangers that exist for them in Afghanistan. We need to secure their safety here in this country. And then the crisis in Ukraine. The Biden administration announced United for Ukraine this past April. It's a commitment to welcoming up to 100,000 Ukrainians who are fleeing Russian aggression. through a more streamlined humanitarian parolee. So again, a specific status in the United States, a specific meaning. They have to be sponsored by someone in the US. They will pass background checks. But if they do pass that and they are awarded the status, they have employment authorization, they have medical benefits, and they can be here, unlike the Afghans, they can be here for 2 years on parolee status before they decide whether or not they want to file for asylum or return home. With all this diversity, I think about the diversity of the arriving communities by country of origin, by immigration status. Trauma is the common thread across all of their different narratives. Their pre-migration, peri, post-migration experiences generally are threaded with the experience of complex trauma that shapes how these folks are adjusting to life in a new country. These are communities that are on the move for safety and survival, and trauma, again, is woven into their narrative. And so I want to take a moment to really unpack what trauma is. It's a threat to one's physical, emotional well-being. It's perceived as overwhelming. It comes with intense feelings of fear and a lack of control over your situation, your abilities, your circumstances. And when you feel overwhelmed, when you're afraid, when you don't feel like you have any control, it's going to leave you feeling helpless. And depending on the duration, the intensity of the trauma experiences, is it collective, is it individual, it has the potential to change how you see yourself, how you see people around you, how you see future opportunities. Also relevant to forcibly displaced populations is the impact of intergenerational and historical and cultural trauma. Intergenerational trauma, it tends to be how we think about patterns of coping and patterns of thinking that are felt across generations. Even ideas around healing falls under that definition. Historical and cultural trauma, this is the trauma that's inflicted on groups of people that have been historically oppressed because of race, ethnicity, religion, and other social identities. It's a trauma, a collective experience of trauma that is experienced within a community, across a generation. It's carried by the individual, it's carried by the collective. And so when I think about new arrivals, they're also entering the United States, especially in the last decade, against this backdrop of increasingly dangerous anti-immigrant rhetoric. An administration that codified anti-immigrant rhetoric into policy, not to mention a global pandemic, national and global racial and immigration justice movements. And I will say that irrespective of immigration status, the threat of being deported is real. That there are communities that are wondering, am I safe? Do I belong here? Am I even welcomed? And while this was a nation that is built on immigrants, the message is quite clear in certain regions of the country that newcomers are not welcomed here, and you have a reason to be afraid. There is a cumulative impact of this on mental health. That what I've seen in practice, what I see in the literature, and it's growing in the literature, is that forcibly displaced people are more likely to exhibit trauma and stress-related symptoms. There is a positional embeddedness in what it means to be a refugee, what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be a newcomer, how people think about their status, their value in society. And when you think about that embeddedness, that positional embeddedness, it places such incredible emotional and cognitive strain on people that are already compromised by past trauma. And we think about what are the implications for how you rebuild your life in that context. And the symptoms are actually they're not hard to see. Over the years, I would say that irrespective of nationality or age, the most common symptoms I see amongst adults is prolonged sadness, difficulty coping. They speak about just changes in their sleep and appetite, or they'll often speak about somatic symptoms. So physical symptoms like chest pains, headaches, tingling sensations that mask a mental health problem. If you are wanting to rebuild your life in a new country, imagine how hard these trauma and stress-related symptoms can be on you, trying to learn a language, figure out public transportation, helping your kids in school. And when it comes to children and youth, we know they develop in the context of a relationship. So if their parents and caregivers struggle with trauma-related symptoms, the children and youth will struggle as well. We see kiddos just struggling in the absence of an adult who can model how to cope, how to make reasonable decisions, how to be compassionate, how to solve problems. And so with youth, children and youth, we tend to see similar symptoms to those of adults, as well as symptoms that make it hard for them to form peer relationships and to learn in school. So they will speak about stomach aches, when they're nervous. We will see acting out behaviors, socially withdrawn behaviors, and difficulty concentrating. We can also see poor mental health symptoms in infants and toddlers in the form of beyond what is typical, excessively intense temperaments, separation anxiety, aggressive and regressive behaviors, difficulty self-soothing. Again, babies will develop in the context of a relationship. And so when they don't have an attuned caregiver that can help model how to cope, how to be responsive and navigate these big emotions, these are kiddos that aren't starting preschool or kindergarten ready to learn because they're stuck in these big sensations. And they start to develop maladaptive ways of reading cues and trying to form relationships and responding to the world around them. And that's at the heart of intergenerational trauma. All of this really does drive behavior. So you may see some of the behavioral manifestations of trauma, whether you work in community-based organizations, if you're in schools and healthcare settings, you might see any of these, from folks that are avoiding visits, missing appointments, to those that are completely checking out and refusing to make decisions because they're so overwhelmed. If you think about immigration, I know that feelings about immigration tend to be quite complicated. And this idea of federal reform, immigration reform at the federal level, we're nowhere near that. But I think what shouldn't be controversial is this idea that if we want people to thrive, if we want people to contribute to their own lives, their family lives, their communities, that they can't do that if they're not well. They can't do that if they don't have access to mental health care to address the mental health symptoms and these behavioral manifestations of trauma. And so I'm often asked, where does mental health care fit in the immigration process? And sadly, the answer is it doesn't. That when I think about resettlement programs, mutual aid associations, even detention centers at the border, they're not mandated to screen for mental health need, nor are they required to provide mental health services. Often when I see programs that focus on helping newcomers adjust to life in a new country, there's a heavy focus on economic self-sufficiency. So find the job, learn the language, figure out how to be financially independent, which I think is incredibly important. People will not feel safe if there's not a roof over their head and they don't have the resources to meet their basic needs. But at the same time, it starts to redirect our focus away from the reality that trauma can be a significant barrier to being economically self-sufficient. It gets in the way of learning the language. It gets in the way of thriving in the workplace and being able to contribute. And that's part of adjustment. That's part of healing. And so we really need to think about this not as an either or, but an and. How do we support economic self-sufficiency, helping people integrate to life in a new community, and emotional well-being that is necessary for people to thrive? And we have to think about, as a community, how are we going to help people feel safe and welcome? Because that too is part of the healing process and the adjustment process. So against that backdrop, I had an opportunity in 2010 to develop a refugee mental health program that would be part of operations in a larger resettlement program. Refugee One is the largest resettlement agency here in Chicago. It primarily served refugees coming through the U.S. refugee program. Now it is serving asylum seekers, families that are coming from Afghanistan, Ukraine, those without status. And they've been doing this good work since 1982. Back in 2010, it's hard to imagine where time has gone, but the ask from the leadership was, we feel really ill-equipped to meet the mental distress we're seeing, that we as an agency are tasked to help people adjust to life in a new community with this host of case management, housing, language services, employment services, but that missing piece of mental health was not there, and they found themselves being really quite reactive. What do we do when we're only at a point where hospitalization was the only answer? So they brought me in and they gave me time, about a year to think about what could this look like. So I went right back to the community leaders of those who were arriving, the communities that were arriving at that time. And back in 2010, it was mostly Somali arrivals, refugees from Burundi, Eritrea, Ethiopia. There were refugees that were coming from Bhutan who had been waiting in camps on the Nepal border for 22 years on average. And so going back to them and asking, how would you talk about mental health? Poring over my clinical training, leaning into the literature, and coming up with a model of how to do this work and do this work really thoughtfully and intentionally in the field. I knew that no matter what, a mental health program had to account for how newcomers think about mental health, because oftentimes when you say this term, it usually is associated with something bad. You're crazy, it's a product of your own moral failing, right? Oftentimes some people will not speak about it, it's just what it is, it exists and we don't see that. I think of that in terms of intergenerational and historical trauma. Oftentimes they will cite physical symptoms, somatic symptoms. So again, the chest pains, the headaches, the tingling sensations that really do mask a mental health problem. And it's also a private matter. So they shouldn't be talking with folks that are outside their family, outside their ethnic community, outside their faith-based community. So many of the cultures, being the collective nature of the folks that we were serving, again, they didn't see it as a problem. That everyone has nightmares, everyone is sad, everyone is nervous all the time. I also thought about just the details of the program that we're serving families, arrivals across the lifespan. So we needed to be developmentally appropriate to the varying ages we were going to see, culturally, linguistically responsive. And I knew for the staff had to reflect the cultures and the languages of the people we were serving and diverse clinical skills to recognize the range of what we could potentially encounter. And this is an image of some of the team members that I was able to direct over that time. I also knew as a researcher the importance of tracking the data, that to move the field forward in refugee immigrant mental health, we had to have empirical evidence of what works for who and under what conditions, and really leverage that knowledge to inform policy, inform programming, and everything in between. And so happy to report the program is called the Refugee One Wellness Program. I directed that program for 11 years before stepping down and remaining as the senior program advisor as I transitioned here to the university to really do more research. The first iteration of the model I developed, which I call the Refugee Grow Model, a mental health care model in resettlement context, was published in my first book, and our 10-year data report is being released in the coming months. And I'll share some of the data that we've learned over the last 10 years, because it really does tell the story of who these folks are and how to respond to their needs. Part of the model that I developed, it was all about universal screening to remove the stigma. We're going to talk to everyone from the time they come in and they do intake with a case manager, to the required State Department orientations, to meeting with someone in the wellness program. They were going to hear about mental health in safe language through universal screening. Majority of the arrivals didn't need more intensive specialized services. Only a quarter of them were enrolled in direct therapy or some type of accompaniment service. But again, the spirit of making it accessible to talk about mental health was part of the model. Served a lot of folks over the last decade, and you'll see that we served folks across the lifespan from pregnancy through older adulthood. What you'll see on this slide is that folks tended to enroll into mental health care services within the first 6 months of being in this country. Or 6 months of engaging in an agency like Refugee One, an immigrant serving, refugee serving organization. And it does speak to that intersection of adjustment stress when you first arrive and getting to know a system and getting to know, how do I navigate my new environment? The top languages, these are the top 6. Arabic was spoken most across the populations we serve, but we also served Swahili, Farsi, Kinyarwanda speakers, Burmese speakers, as well as Rohingya. And then gender breakdown, roughly 50-50. And I think that comes back to just the education and removing the stigma of engaging in conversations around mental health. This slide reflects the general trends in mental health problems we saw across adults and children. General adjustment refers to the stresses that come with navigating life in Chicago that induce anxiety. And we saw that show up with adults and children. The other needs, top needs we saw in adults, trauma and stress-related symptoms, mood depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. For children and youth, we were seeing a lot of referrals from schools, speaking to academic needs, behavioral needs. We were able to identify social emotional delays, again, thinking about intergenerational relationships, the impact of parent-caregiver stress on children, and then also discussions around family relationship problems. Tends to be a lot of conflict around how to navigate a bicultural identity. What does it mean to be an American youth versus retaining home culture values? And I offer this slide because if I look at the top 5, irrespective of age, of the top needs, general adjustment, PTSD, academic behavioral needs, depression, and anxiety, the top 5 countries that we served in our program over the last decade was Afghanistan, Burma, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, and Syria. And you'll see even visually that the needs, the mental health presentation looks very different by country of origin. And so with that diversity, our approach to providing services had to look different as well. That we had a number of communities that preferred individual treatment because they liked the safety and the privacy of it, but there were those that preferred to be in groups because it mapped onto cultural patterns of communication. When I look at the Western modalities that we adapted in terms of treatment services, the top 6 were psychoeducation, narrative therapy, solutions-focused therapy, social emotional learning for our youth, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, psychiatric services. We had a psychiatrist on the team. And it's, again, top 5 countries, they use the different modalities to varying degrees. Which modalities mapped on to culture and how they want to process their needs look different by community. And we also recognize that children have unique needs different from their peers here in Chicago, different from their peers here in the country. Over time, because of referrals from parents, from teachers, from staff, the team and I developed our own social emotional learning curriculum, which I know is big in schools now, but a curriculum that really targeted what we knew refugee, asylum-seeking, undocumented children needed, because their experiences were quite unique from their peers in the public school system. They needed more information on how to cope, how to identify negative emotions, a lot around trusting others. And again, that bicultural identity, how do I navigate what it means to be an American youth versus navigating what it meant to be a youth in my home country? Client participation. When I think about the mental health care model, what I developed was never intended for long-term care. The idea was always to restore a sense of agency, give people that sense of hope, and launch them back into their own lives, recognizing they can lean on mental health care services if it ever came up. When I think about the length of treatment, which shows up on this slide, that varied. The time that folks were engaged in services varied by country of origin. And I think it really does speak to those pre-arrival experiences and what people experience in transit to the United States. Iraqi and Syrian refugees were coming from direct warfare, and so we tended to see that they were engaged in sessions and treatment longer, whereas other communities that maybe were still in harm's way, but were not in immediate danger because they were waiting in cities or in refugee camps, it looked different in terms of their engagement in services. But based on clinician reports, irrespective of culture of origin, treatment modality, we saw positive change over time across communities. So it speaks to why this work really does matter. I love the symbolism of this tree. This tends to be where I like to end or really transition the conversations, that it speaks to external environmental forces, that they can be there to try and disrupt and harm you, but with the right supports and nourishment, people can continue to thrive and grow. I think that the work that I shared with you, just a taste of some of the data in my research program and some of the things that I really think about in our communities when it comes to promoting health and mental well-being in refugee groups, that the direct practice with forcibly displaced populations really does speak to those front-end experiences that really do lead to how people experience post-resettlement adjustment and stress. That the research provides insights to the type of social supports and types of mental health care models that can be very effective in addressing some of those pre-arrival, in-transit migration experiences and post-resettlement experiences. And we can use that research to inform community programming as well as how to develop a workforce to do this. And then the lessons learned from frontline service providers and the research together, we can use that to leverage any type of reform, how we think about immigration policy, resettlement policy, healthcare policies, these policies that directly impact the daily lives of new arrivals. And we can have that conversation when we look at the three in concert together. I couldn't have asked for a better academic home than UChicago and the Crown Family School. It was such a joy to join a team of such intentional and invested faculty who want to lead discussions and are leading discussions and research on immigration, global health, and supporting mental health amongst these communities. I think the addition of the Kippart Center for Global Health is only going to increase that dialogue, and these wonderful collaborations and partnerships with the Mansueto Institute to continue to elevate these conversations that are happening not just abroad, but they're happening in our communities here and now. So thank you. Zip through that. Again, thank you for your grace with my little one making it into the recording. One day he will be so proud that he showed up in that way. But I do want to open the floor to questions. This is my contact information. It's just aihilado@uchicago.edu. I'm going to stop my share and I'm happy to have a conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. So appreciated. Like I can't say enough how important it is to have folks like you who with this long history of direct practice work in the field, developing new programs, and then figuring out like on the ground what matters and what works for families who need services. And so while waiting for folks to either raise their hands, ideally it's just to raise your hands and then I'll have you come off mute and ask questions. So as folks are thinking about their questions, I think what I would like you to speak on just for a quick moment is, given that you are coming into a more heavy research space, when you were in more of a practice space and developing those that intervention and all of those things, when you were trying to look to the research to see where the existing research could guide you, what was missing? What were the things where you're like, there's nothing here to help me, I'm gonna just have to make it up as I go, or have it come directly from what I'm learning from participants? Like, what were those missing questions that are driving you now in the research that you do?
I think that when I use the term forcibly displaced groups, I think about refugees and immigrants. We tend to think of them as a monolith, and that just isn't the case. That the circumstances surrounding how and why they left their country, the circumstances in waiting that they experience, and then their experiences in coming to the United States. Every city matters, right? That collective understanding of context is often missing in the literature because we're getting these high-level conversations. And I think what I'm really trying to do with my research is to drill down and show that there is even such diversity within individual groups that are coming from Afghanistan and Rohingya, that we really need to move away from, this is a standard approach, let's apply trauma-focused CBT because it's going to work for forcibly trauma-experienced populations, forcibly displaced populations, and it just doesn't land that way. That there are cultural nuances, that there are things that we need to understand, and there are cultural healing practices that originate from the communities that can be even more beneficial than what we as Western trained clinicians try and bring into the field. And I'd like to see more of that. Oftentimes when I'm thinking about research, this question of rigor comes forward. Are you going to do a randomized control trial? Because that's the gold standard. And there's, as a clinician at heart, there is that ethical dilemma of how can I deny an intervention for the sake of wanting to test what works and what doesn't work and get that empirical evidence when I know you're already vulnerable, when I know that you could benefit from the intervention. That is a hard line to cross. In my work, I have done RCTs, and the way I've gone around it, as from a moral standpoint, from an ethical standpoint, is a cohort model. So it's not that you're going to be denied services. We're just going to delay it long enough so we can understand if this works. We did this with home visiting for families. These are families that could benefit from having an early childhood professional supporting them in the process of them trying to support little ones in the home, birth to 3. But again, it's that tension of what truth, what knowledge is valued most? What is considered rigorous? And how can we apply that to populations that don't engage in research readily? And yet we say so much about them, but we don't hear their voices in the work. And if we do, Maybe we're obscuring other voices in the process, or we could be potentially causing harm. And that's my kind of focus now at the Crown School. How do we walk that fine line of providing empirical evidence while protecting the communities that could benefit from this evidence? This is evidence that can drive policy change. This is evidence that can drive programming, but they're missing in that conversation. And how do we safely bring them into that space? And as a researcher, it's imperative that I protect that, right? And I protect those communities.
Wow.
Yeah, the tension is there. It definitely is.
That is a very fine line to walk. They want to open it up and see, do others have questions they would want to add before I keep asking more?
Hi, Aimee. I have a question. I'm Sonia. Thank you so much for presenting this topic and being one of the first to kick off the forced migration series for the TIWG, or Trauma Interest Work Group. I am really resonating with this tension of RCTs. And again, the cohort model is something, never done an RCT, but I've definitely done where everybody gets the intervention at some point, right? And I guess, so I just want to highlight, like, I feel that tension. I appreciate it. I just want to, I'm resonating also with, you highlighting the importance of remembering that there's diversity within the same ethnic groups, right? So it's not a monolith. And I'm just wondering, even across the different cultural groups that have been served through Refugee One, is there anything that really sticks out to you regarding some of the interventions or strategies or ways to engage for each cultural group? So I know you showed by the varied services that each cultural group might have taken, but is there anything that just sticks out that might be useful? Because I agree, like TFCBT may not be useful for everybody. It might just be more of psychoeducation and, just providing support groups and finding a way to connect culturally through traditions, that it might be more of that as the intervention versus CBT. So I'm just wondering if there was anything that sticks out to you that you can recall.
I oftentimes lean on crisis intervention models when I was thinking about how to develop this mental health care model in a resettlement context. A lot of the work around psychological first aid resonated. Again, this idea that we're not talking about acute crisis. When I think about PFA, it tends to be, okay, we're going to implement this after a school shooting. We're going to implement this after a natural disaster like a hurricane. But some of the tenets of it, where you're talking about promoting a sense of safety and agency and hope, some of those are real common denominators for folks that are really experiencing acute adjustment distress. It is hard to move to Chicago. Every community that has arrived are coming from tropical climates. So the winter itself, that is just a factor. That curve of trying to adjust to life in a completely different geographic region, completely different temperature kind of gradient, a lot of that does matter. And so beyond like very specific theoretical approaches, sometimes providing that baseline of emotional safety and physical safety, that it can be as simple as asking, have you guys had a meal today? Do you need a space to pray? Being able to remind people that they do have the skills of making decisions in their own life because they've done it so far. But oftentimes trauma and crisis, it makes us forget what we can do. And so some of the initial work is really restoring that sense of understanding and belief in that agency and efficacy that's so critical as a baseline. I know folks dive into, let's have a conversation about trauma. And I will argue that if you jump in too soon without a relationship and giving people the adequate foundation for even talking about that, you will actually cause more harm. You place them in greater distress because sometimes the environment that they've lived in, it wasn't adequate enough for them to develop the skills of coping, or maybe they forgot how to cope. People that have been waiting a really long time, when you hear their stories, I used to be able to do this and now I don't know how. That's what displacement does. That's what terror and trauma does. And so to go in and ask about what are the most terrifying things you experienced is actually placing them in greater psychological and emotional harm. So long way of me saying, we got to go back to the building blocks. Are you safe? Do you feel physically, emotionally safe? Do you feel that you have the agency to make decisions on your own? Can I help you with that? Can I help you, restore that sense of hope? It's not saying you have to get over this, but it's that idea of let's validate, this is hard. and what you've experienced is hard, and there's a way forward. And you can do that, you know, in a very accompaniment supportive role. And that seems to cut across all communities. Folks just need that.
Thank you. That resonates a lot with the trauma work that we do. Like establishing a sense of safety is the first line of defense.
Yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
People jump to TFCBT. I start with, can you offer a glass of tea? Like a cup of tea. Why don't we start there? And we can work from there.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, Aimee. Hi, Claudio. You and I.
Yes, we've seen
Yeah.
in other circles.
That's right. Yeah, a great presentation. Your example there reminds me a little bit of, again, this comes from my immigrant father, where he said, like, initially coming here and turning on the hot and cold water, H meant helado, which was cold in
Yes.
Spanish, and C meant caliente, where he was from. So like those little basic things, you think about like the TFCBT, we're talking about the difference between H and C, just to be able to know like that I'm getting the right temperature water that I need. But yeah, so those little day-to-day functioning, how to navigate your grocery store, your community CTA, all those things are super helpful. And those building blocks, I appreciate the attention to that. I also think about, like, I wonder, communities that are coming, that are forcibly displaced, and that context and the nuance that you mentioned. Wondering, like, to what degree the communities that are being forcibly displaced and arriving here are aware of, like, also the historical reasons and factors behind that, more so than maybe us who are here receiving and welcoming them. Like, do we see a discord or dissonance in that they're aware that perhaps militarized involvement of, like, imperial nations like the US into their country have forced that displacement, and maybe that's not something that us here from, like, what can be known as an imperial core are not so sensitive to that or are dismissive of that? And does that create some sort of a tension in a potential supportive relationship?
You know, it shows up differently by communities. There are communities that were arriving that were acutely aware of that. And it's coming to mind the Iraqis that came. You know, oftentimes in treatment, they would talk about, you all invaded our country and you disrupted our government. And then I come here and I'm told I was a doctor, I was a lawyer, and now I have to have a survival job in a factory, or you want me to drive an Uber, right? There is that sense of, I mean, there's that indignation, like, how could you, how dare you, right? That after everything we've been, this is all I get. We've seen that with the Afghan arrivals too, that you pulled us out of Afghanistan, we waited on military bases, and now we have no idea what's going to happen next. And now we have to file for asylum. And it's, again, by culture, it's that sense of, there's a book out, the Ungrateful Refugee, and even the title alone, there's this expectation of, you're here in the United States and we're going to help you. But they acutely are aware of the ways in which the US has played a role in why they're displaced. It really does come up in treatment that for some, seeing someone, what it looks like to be American, is really scary. I think that's, in some ways, it has helped me to be a Filipina, that I don't look like the typical American that they think of because I'm not, you know, blonde hair, blue eyed. But this idea of America is complicated and it's complex for them. And they're walking into their own experience of that history of engagement with America, but also they're walking into this really heated socio-political climate where they feel firsthand whether they're welcome and safe, and people are not afraid to tell them, right? That they see it in the news and they talk about it and they carry all of that cumulatively, and that influences how people adjust and live. So that's got to be in the room too, right? I know in clinical questions, it's what's it like to sit across from me? What's it like to be here? You know, and it tends to come out. Like when they talk about just inequities in housing, inequities in job opportunities and salaries.
Hi, if there's time, I had another question. Thank you for your presentation, and I guess, yeah, welcome to the university and all that. But I wanted to ask, considering like there has been maybe significant, maybe not significant shifts in at least who the leaderships are, some of the policy visions are for immigration in this country. it seems like it's been a little slower to roll back to where we were pre-Trump era. But I was wondering what you think are the current most pressing things where the current positions aren't matching the research, or where it really seems like we need to be pressing our policymakers and decision makers to bring things more in concordance, or that we should be looking more for the research, I guess.
It's a big question. I'm watching the time, so I'm happy to stay on. There are things that, again, I think are in part community specific. So I think, the Afghan Adjustment Act that I mentioned, there's that, but we just got the ruling around DACA, that said DACA was illegal, and we think about, it's not just about, there's an element of the policies that people just tend to think about status, but they don't think about contribution, and I think that when you start to look at the intersection between economics and immigration, that it is very clear that an immigrant workforce could meet the needs that we're seeing in the economy, and people are not seeing that. And when you start to see restrictive immigration policy, you start to feel the burn, when it comes to other parts of what a functioning government, a functioning society look like. And I think that's what's missing. We know this. Folks that do this work, we realize that it's not just, we want to promote mental health and we want to be welcoming communities. And we know that welcoming communities, immigrant communities that are arriving, are contributing in substantial ways, in diverse ways, not just culture, but to the fabric of the work and how a country runs. And I think that's missing. I think about what they're trying to do with DACA and blocking new applications. We're talking about millions of people that are paying taxes, and they are in all sectors of society. And now you're saying that you don't have a place here. What is going to be your response? And it comes back to, how do we frame this so policymakers can see that immigration status is not just a humanitarian effort, that it is also good for our society in so many different ways beyond just a humanitarian effort. And I think that's a long way of saying we need research to start showing those connections in ways that policymakers can hear it. That matters a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a fabulous answer and fabulous way to end. We need research that not only does the work, but communicates it in a way that policymakers can do. And I think folks like you who have that practice background, that background in the field, can help in that communication process.
Being able to translate what we see on the ground to, again, this larger vision for a healthy and thriving society. And it's not about othering. This is not about them over there, but they're here and they're part of our communities. So how do we think about that in a very intentional, thoughtful, and inclusive way?
Yeah. So everyone join me. Thank you, Aimee, for welcoming you to the university, and thank you for this presentation.
It's such a pleasure. I look forward to staying connected.
Yeah. All right.